Welcome to Writing Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. But I'm not talking to a writer so much today. I'm talking to an agent. I have a lot of questions that come to me about agents, and I thought rather than answer these questions myself, let's just get an agent to answer the kinds of questions that I typically get asked about agents. And I think the best way to do this is to just really just dive in. And there's links in the description for this episode where you can go to the manuscript wish list that Emmy has, and you can kind of walk through that with me and Emmy as we kind of get into what writers should consider regarding agents. I'm talking to Emmy Nordstrom Higdon, and Emmy is an agent with Westwood Creative Artists. And Emmy, I think that a good way to kind of get through this, as we were talking about before, and I think something that would be really useful to you listening, is if we just walk through Emmy's manuscript wish list. So, Emmy has actually done a very lengthy, like when I printed it out, it was 8 pages long. It's a very kind of lengthy, well-considered manuscript wish list. So you can find this, if you just search, for Emmy Nordstrom Higdon, my manuscript wish list, or, go to Westwood Creative Artists, their page for Emmy. We'll link off to this. And, there's all sorts of ways you can get a hold of this document. I'm going to quote from it and talk really specifically about parts of it and get, Emmy to explain a bit more. But I think just the first thing that would, I think, be helpful to everybody is just if you kind of would talk a little bit about how you come to be an agent, because as you note here, you've got a PhD in justice-oriented social work and even have peer-reviewed publications in public health and psychology. So I don't think there's an obvious path from that to being a literary agent.
No, it's true. I did have a full career in social work. I would say that I practiced for about, I guess, on and off for 10 years or so before I came to publishing. So it's not the most traditional path to get here. I started working in social work when I was pretty young. I did frontline social work as an emergency shelter worker mostly, and I worked in mental health and addictions for a while. And that definitely informs kind of the approach I take to my agenting work as well. So I started, when I was working on my PhD, I started working at an independent bookstore in Toronto. I was hired here because I had a background in social justice work, and they were looking for someone to kind of help curate the shelves alongside, the regular bookseller kind of tasks of, like the retail world. But the store that I worked at did a lot of work with educators and with school boards. And so one of my primary responsibilities at the time was to kind of we read a lot of books and made a lot of recommendations to teachers and to caregivers and to educators of all different kinds about what kinds of books they should be including in their curriculum, on their classroom bookshelves, in their libraries, home libraries, all the way up to university course recommended reading lists, that kind of thing. And so I did that part-time throughout most of my PhD, just earning money. And at some point I decided, I was also working in research at the time. And at some point I decided I don't think that I'm ready to jump in and go down this tenured professor route as far as my academic career goes. So I started thinking about different ways I could use kind of the research background I had and the social justice background I had to make kind of a lateral career move. And it was actually from listening to a podcast that I discovered what kind of the day-to-day was like for agents. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, that's a lot of the kinds of things that I do now. It's just a different industry. And so, I ended up taking an internship at the Rights Factory. They were incredibly generous with me, sort of marching in, having no idea what I was doing at all. Sam Hyatt, who is the founding agent there, was incredibly welcoming and generous with what he was willing to teach me. And that was kind of how I got started.
One reason I want to talk to you about an agent in this particular, being an agent in this particular way of going through your wish list is, as we were kind of talking about on email, I think a lot of writers have the idea that all agents are the same.
Yeah.
And that they do the same things, and
For
that,
sure.
there's not a, whereas I think you'd probably agree that like it's very much about this relationship you have with the agent, and do you fit with the agent?
Yes, 100%.
Are they a fan of you, in
Yeah.
a way, like, and can they represent you, not just where they're going to get you the most money and the most power, but like,
Hmm.
are they like a good advocate for what you want to do? Because sometimes it can be a bad idea to get a bit of advance. Sometimes it
100%.
can,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of like things that come into play, and it really gets into like, what's are you trying to accomplish as a writer? Does this person see like your vision and share your vision? And I'm just curious, before we get into kind of the minutia here, how do you
Yeah.
see the agent author relationship?
Yeah, it's incredibly unique. When people talk about agenting sort of in a homogenous way, it mostly confuses me, because it couldn't be less true that all agents are the same. We're definitely all very, very different. And that's one of the things that's hard about the industry. It's also one of the things I like about it in some senses, because the way that most agencies work is that it's sort of a collective of people who all do the same kind of job function. But I would say that we all do it, at most agencies anyway, we're all given the freedom to sort of do it in our own way, which is something that I'm super grateful for. We all definitely have our own goals as well within agenting, and I think that that plays a role in the relationship as well. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is advocating for marginalized authors, and seeing the kinds of books that I can see myself reflected in as a reader on shelves, whether that's like a literal reflection, like someone who shares sort of one of the identity markers that I have, or whether it's more of like a figurative, like an emotional reflection or a thematic reflection or what have you. And I think that there is space for more of that, like in the industry overall. So that's something that I take into consideration with all of my books. And it's not something that necessarily all agents do take into consideration when they're looking for authors to represent, or when they're advocating, choosing what they're going to advocate for, in terms of acquisitions, or in terms of what authors should be prioritizing, that kind of thing. I definitely have authors, like I would say my clients who I currently work with are on like a spectrum of, caring about or being invested in that goal of mine. But one of the first things that I always ask people who are querying with me is what their goals are and what they're looking for in an agent, because I'm not necessarily the type of agent, I'm not fooling myself in the sense that I know that my role is primarily as a salesperson, but I don't really see myself as like valuing that as much as I value, getting books that I think are really, really important or thought provoking or interesting for some reason, into the hands of readers. And so, yeah, I do really think that. And it's also true that the business considerations of agenting aren't necessarily as straightforward as some authors think. So yeah, the advance is a really, really good example of that. I mean, it's great when we can get a huge advance for an author. Obviously, we want everyone to be well compensated for their work, but in terms of being especially a debut author, there's a lot to think about in terms of how that will reflect on you going forward. Also, like whether or not your sales are able to match that advanced amount so that you end up getting royalties, which are a more sustainable source of income. There's all kinds of considerations. So I think that, yeah, the role of an agent is not necessarily kind of a one size fits all model. I think it definitely has a lot to do with where authors see themselves going and what kinds of supports they're looking for in their work.
I think the advance is a nice, quick example of something I want
Yeah.
to talk in a bit of a different way about, which is there's a lot of, I think, assumptions or myths that people have about the publishing industry and about agents and how they fit into the publishing industry. And I see a lot of them tied to advance. One really simple thing a lot of writers don't understand is that there is a tax difference between this big giant
Huge.
chunk of money
Yes.
and a bunch of smaller amounts of money.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like you could get that same amount of money coming in a big lump sum, or like over a couple of years in royalties is going to
Yeah,
get taxed differently. Like
exactly.
so there is like really just simple practical things to consider, but then there's like the death spiral, as you of like, the midlist death spiral, I think it's been named, where the orders coming for the next book are going to be contingent potentially on sales of this book. Like there's all sorts of like complicated things that I don't think authors should think too much about that stuff. No. But it's like you need to either be thinking about it or have the agent thinking about it for you, right? Like and not necessarily just the obvious things. Like one thing strikes me in your wish list here, just to kind of jump ahead to a different section. So there's a couple of things like this where you note here, I have a strong preference for standalone books. I think most writers would be surprised by that, because there is a perception amongst writers that agents and publishers want series. I don't think that's really true at this point. I mean, it's sometimes true, sure, but I think, can you talk a bit more about that? Why do you have a strong preference for standalone books?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a misconception. And I think that it has to do with the way that sort of sales and marketing have changed over time. The reason why I prefer standalone books, and part of it has to do with the fact that I'm a newer agent as well. So when I think about the authors who might be querying me, if a New York Times bestselling author came to me and said, I wrote this trilogy, I'd be like, awesome. Because often, publishers are going to look back at your publication history in terms of making their decisions, especially when they're negotiating how many books to sign a contract for. So that's sort of one aspect, is that as an agent who's only been working for 2 years, I don't get a lot of queries from really, really well-established authors who already have, amazing sales records that I can take to publishers and say, listen, this author has proven that, there's an appetite for their work, and that if you produce 3 more of their books, they will all sell. So what often happens is that, we'll take a book out on submission, and once we get an offer of acquisition, we have to sort of negotiate with the publisher what that contract is actually for, right? So it's never, I don't know that ever a publisher comes into it with sort of like a set idea in mind of what they want. It usually has to do with the individual editor and kind of what kind of climate their imprint is in that year. I think all publishers have different preferences, but yeah, these days, often what you'll see, especially in young adult, is like a 2-book deal where, the first book is kind of the quote unquote breakout book. So that's like the sure thing that the editor is kind of pinning their hopes and dreams on. And then the second book is meant to sort of follow up that book. And the catch with that arrangement is that the first book has to do really, really well, right? The author is pinning their expectations on the sales of that first book. So when I say that I like standalone books in my query inbox, it's often because my preference is to be able to go to a publisher and negotiate a single book deal that's really, really favorable, so that, everyone's hopes, I think, are that the first book will break out, it will be fantastic. But if they, for some reason, something happens and the sales are moderate, the author's future publication and their experience with that imprint aren't completely contingent on having had a breakout bestseller the first time around. And when people come with series or with like trilogies or duologies even, they can be really, really difficult to sell for that reason, because these days publishers, I think, are making fewer and fewer of those deals where they think they have a sure thing right off the bat. And I think that's actually probably beneficial for authors, sort of on the whole. It doesn't mean that the door's not open for series, especially through options in contracts that, when the first book does do really, really fantastic in terms of its like numbers. But I think that the sell is definitely easier on a standalone great book that a reader can pick up and get a really satisfying experience out of as a, one-shot kind of project.
Now, you're also note here a little further on that you're interested in high concept horror, body horror, ghost stories, occult, spiritualism, psychological, social, political, weird. No zombies, please. I think that is something that would trip up a lot of people, because again,
true.
Now you use zombies here, but it used to be vampires, right? Like there'll be these cycles of monsters that come around where it just seems like they're everywhere. And writers often will have the perception that, oh, well, then publishing world must be looking for this. This is the new trend. And they'll start what I always tell writers is that if there's a bandwagon going by your house, it's too late to jump on the bandwagon.
It is. It means that like 3 years ago, that was the bandwagon in terms of
Mhm.
books that we've submitted. Also, I should say there are some items on my manuscript wish list which will never change, no matter what the bandwagon is, though, and zombies are one of them. They creep me out. So
You don't like
generally
zombies?
speaking, well, I don't like characters who I fall in love with slowly and irreversibly wasting away in front of my eyes.
Sure.
But no, I mean, but part of it is that, yeah, like anything that is selling really, really well, like in the moment, it means that those books were acquired like 2 or 3 seasons ago, right? And so editors at this point are looking for the next thing that will sell really, really well, not the thing that is currently selling really, really well.
And they already signed 10 other ones just like
Exactly.
that, or
Yep.
have printed them, or in the 80s, Vampire Diaries was one thing where
That's it.
they just like, yeah, let's just pump more money into this book we already own, as opposed to
Yes.
like make a new acquisition, which makes sense. It's already
Yep.
in, but people don't often realize that as writers. And I'll see writers, I mean, if you want to write a zombie novel, write a zombie novel, but I'll see
Yeah.
like writers, writing zombie novels, and they don't necessarily have a real affinity for the genre. They just think like it's hot. And that attitude, I find, one, it produces a bad book. And I don't feel personally that you can overcome a bad book, no matter what.
It's really, really hard.
It's really hard. You get bad books published, but they are in many ways the exception rather than the rule, despite what people want to say.
Yep.
And even when they are published, there's typically some mitigating reason they've been published, like someone incredibly famous has published it, or what have you, like Snooki wrote it,
Yep.
or what not, but anyway, it's worth noting that part of your answer there is just like a pure personal thing. Like, no matter how good or saleable a zombie novel might be, if you're not the fit for a zombie novel, it's not a good book for you, right?
And I always have to warn people too that like my manuscript wish list is what I want from authors who I don't work with yet,
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a fantastic horror author who's already on my list, whose work I love, and they have a zombie novel, like a year from now, and they come to me and say, I have this zombie book, I'm not going to say to them like, no, I don't represent zombie books. Like in the vast majority of circumstances, like I do have a couple of hard lines where I do ask people to change things sometimes, but that's not one of them. But in terms of like things that I'm going to voluntarily and enthusiastically want to take on, like something that's super trendy right now that also sort of squeaks me out is not it. It's interesting because sometimes I get people who say, like, they'll send me emails and they'll be like, I know you said in your manuscript wish list you don't want this, but just in case. And I have a really hard time with that because I'm like, you're already telling me I'm not going to like your book, so like why like why do you think this is the right fit for me? Unless sometimes there is a really compelling reason, but more often than not it's just people are not necessarily respecting the ask.
Well, you also mentioned here you're not seeking books with plague, virus, and pandemic themes. Again, I think like a lot of authors have a weird misconception that this is something the publishing industry wants.
Oh my God, I think we're very divided on that. I think like you're right, there have been some like already like huge books that have pandemic themes, and like it's just not, personally it's just not my jam. As somebody, like maybe 5 years from now I'll be interested in other people's perception of this thing that we're going through right now, but unless you are like the #1 world expert on something, chances are good that while we're in the middle of the situation is not the right time to be trying to convince people that your perspective on it is reliable or interesting.
My friend Salima Nawaz put out a book called Songs for the End of the World, which is a book that was accepted and going to be published before the pandemic hit.
Oh, it's so hard.
You know that book then.
Yes.
For people who don't know, Salima predicted effectively in this novel by accident. She wasn't planning to like prediction, but it's a novel about a coronavirus pandemic that takes place, and there's a writer whose book, about a coronavirus pandemic comes out, and all this had been accepted and run through the editors and everything and set to come out before this pandemic hits. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden her science fiction novel becomes like effectively a work of realism.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it was but that was a weird example
Yes,
where it was like a bunch of flukes aligning. Although
totally. And
cinema
that
would tell you,
happens.
you could almost predict with, like
Yeah.
clockwork, this thing was going to happen after she'd done
Yeah.
this research that horrified her. But for the
Yeah.
but even that book, which was like right on the forefront and the cusp of all this stuff, there's a lot of hesitancy to publish it. And when they published it,
Yeah.
and they were planning to publish it, of course, but like if you get the book, like this isn't even a tale out of school. Like if you get the book, the first thing you'll read is like, this book was written before the pandemic
Yeah.
hit and blah, 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 blah. Like they're very much, trying to make it very clear that this isn't an attempt to like cash in on a pandemic or anything. And it's a
Yeah. And
wonderful
that's
book.
really like,
But for the most
yeah.
part, I think people have that attitude that somehow there's some, new popularity here.
Yeah, it's very weird. I mean, I think that there was some popularity to those kinds of books beforehand, right? Like,
Mhm.
I think that they're like pandemic books, dystopian books, like all of that kind of stuff. I think that there is a very different perception about it now than there was like 3 years ago. But there's always been a market for that. I think that the thing is that, like, yeah, it feels weird to me to want to like bring capitalism into that, the way that we're all processing these feelings. So for me, it's a
Well,
strange feeling, but
you also not liking zombie books. In many ways, zombies and virus books are the same.
yeah, exactly.
Like at least the modern zombie is effectively
Yeah.
a virus, right? And a capitalist virus. And it's really interesting to me, like to kind of just note through some of these things that you want and don't want, because I think they like the lesson in some ways. I think that writers can draw out of it is that like agents are people, like they
Yeah.
have their likes and dislikes. They're
For
not just
sure.
like automatons, trying to get the most bang for your
No.
buck. They're really trying to work with the writers that they find interesting,
Hmm.
that they think they can do a good job working with, and and really help kind of bring these books into the world in the best way that they possible, which may or may not
Yeah.
involve how the writer thought in their with context, was the best idea.
Yeah. And honestly, I could probably go through my manuscript wish list and color code it for like what things
Mhm.
are personal and what things are like market and what things are like just
Sure.
traditional publishing challenges that like I'm not like the best at, or that I'm not the strongest in.
Can you talk about some of the terms that you use that I think are
Mm.
common terms, but a lot of writers don't know? Like, for example, upmarket. Not a lot of people
Yeah,
know what upmarket means. So could you just maybe explain that, and also just the difference? You represent both literary and commercial fiction,
I do.
whereas some authors don't, or some
Yeah,
agents don't. But can you just explain a little bit about like one, what's the difference between literary and commercial fiction in terms of how like an agent would use those words and how they're used in the
absolutely.
industry, and also what's upmarket mean?
For sure. So for me personally, it mostly comes down to the writing style when I'm reading a query. Literary books tend to be, for me, like more on the meditative, kind of poetic end of the craft spectrum, whereas commercial books tend to be like much more on the accessible end of the craft spectrum. When people call things like voicey, that's what I'm always looking for in commercial books, is that kind of like really confessional tone where it sounds like somebody is just having a conversation with you, and it's really easy to follow and you can kind of lose yourself in it that way. Whereas with literary, I think it's almost like I mean, I don't really believe in opposites, but if you were going to go down that spectrum, the way you would get lost in a literary book is more through, like imaginative detail, poetic language, metaphor, like those kinds of things. I don't love the stereotype that literary books need to be like super pretentious. I'm not really into that style of writing that's like very, very highbrow and academic. I still think literary should be able to be enjoyed by lots of people. I don't think you need like $4 words every 3 seconds to make a literary book really enjoyable, but I do think there is something about kind of the approach to like insight and reflection and sort of exploration in a literary book that's a little bit different than something that's more character or plot driven on the commercial side of things. And I always tell people, I think like the best way to get a sense for which books are which, at least for my taste, are kind of, if you look at like, maybe today is the right day to talk about this, but like if you look at like the books that get longlisted for the Giller, like those are going to be your like literary kind of gems, right? And if you're writing in that arena, like those are the books that you're kind of competing against in terms of sales and award nominations, among other things, but also, you know, funding and reviews and all of that kind of stuff. Placement in bookstores. And then versus if you go to like a grocery store and you're looking on their shelves for like at, you know, when you're at the cash and there's like a bunch of paperback books in front of you. Ironically, it's like the only place I see books these days because we're still in like quasi lockdown in Toronto. So I can like picture my shopper's bookshelf very clearly right now in my mind. But those books are more what I would call commercial books. Like they're ones that, you know, you expect for basically anybody to be able to pick up the paperback and just like enjoy it for the story that it is. For all of my books, I like them to have some sort of like thought-provoking aspect. So I don't really think that commercial books need to be dumbed down for people. I think lots of people are in it for like learning things and for, you know, having their ideas changed or molded by what they're reading. And likewise, I don't think that literary books should be without plot. I really like books to have a story, you know, but there are some differences in like your target audience, where they might be sold, who you're going to compete against, that kind of stuff. So, you know, like the most successful commercial books, I would say, are the ones that, you know, like everybody would see their name on a cover and recognize it. Dan Brown, Lee Child, Stephen King, whoever. They're like your household book names typically. And then upmarket, I would say, is like, if you were on a spectrum from like 1 to 10, where like 10 is literary and 1 is commercial, I would say that upmarket is like a 6, like a solid 6 or 6.5 maybe. So it's books that, you know, have a little bit of like a literary taste to them, or a literary like feel when you're reading them. They are like a little more meandering. They're not like quite as straightforward as your average like commercial novel might be. But they're the kind of thing that people pick up typically for like book clubs or long plane rides, or they tend to get reviewed in like newspapers as opposed to getting reviewed in like, I'm trying to think where we even review commercial books anymore, like blogs. Like, but yeah, they tend to be, I would say they're like in the middle in terms of accessibility and in terms of like the speed at which you might be expected to read them, or what kinds of audiences they're targeting. I would compare them to like when people say like women's fiction, they often are referring to like upmarket books, or like book club books are often, I hear a lot of millennial fiction these days, which I think is like the most funny term, but I think that in a lot of senses, people mean upmarket books when they're saying those kinds of
Or
things.
upmarket YA or something. What I
Exactly.
found upmarket these days seems to be the new word that people are just using
Yes,
for in between commercial literary. Like they
exactly.
used to say slipstream, and then they were saying
Totally.
something else before that. I forget. Like things
Publishers
like,
also love to say like genre bending. That's like the word I
yeah,
hear all the time. It might not be like 100% a genre book, which we would categorize as something more commercial, but it might have aspects of genre, which like takes it out of that kind of like pure literary, you know,
like Time
field.
Traveler's Wife, I think is the
Yes.
example I always use. It's like it's clearly a science fiction book, but it also
Yeah.
is clearly like a, you know, kind of quote unquote literary. Like
I feel
it's
like
kind of.
Station 11 too. People like hover in the
Mhm,
bookstore, like, where does
mhm.
this go, you know?
Yeah, and it's weird. It's almost like a kind of like horror. I think is a interesting genre to look at
So
because
interesting.
people look down on horror traditionally, but then all of a sudden they started trying to justify. So then you'll have like horror, and then there's literary horror, and then there's
Yes.
like upmarket horror. But
Yeah,
really, it's just all the same thing. But there's this perception about how
yeah,
it's going to be marketed,
exactly.
and where the writer maybe sees themselves as a stylist or not.
Yeah, that question of marketing really, it's something that comes up like way earlier than people think it does. So like when you're saying marketing, you're meaning like when people are like, you know, getting their ad on a bus shelter or whatever. But like
Mhm.
when we're thinking marketing as agents, often it comes like even when I'm pitching a book to an editor,
Yeah,
because
sure.
like I actually really hate it. I think it's something that editors and agents both really struggle with, but often imprints aren't open to things that they aren't familiar with, right? So if you have a really, really commercial imprint, I wouldn't be able to pitch them like a literary horror book because it's just not something that they necessarily know how to sell or have the connections to publicize, or even like sometimes their editors won't really be like the most qualified editors for that genre. But if I come along with like something that's really, really great and super marketable, then yeah, they're all over it. So that question of like where your book fits in the market, like I think about that even from the query stage, which is like a little premature. Maybe there's still some shaping to do at that point, but unfortunately, like it really does determine a lot about how I build my submission lists and who I know who might be interested in buying the book or publishing the book.
I think there's a lot of misperceptions that surround this topic that
Yeah.
writers have. So one really common one I hear a lot is people will tell me like, oh, I'm writing a book that it's a zombie novel, but it's also a romance. So it's like fans of romance and fans of zombie novels will both love it. It's like, no, actually, neither fans of romance nor zombie novels will love it. Only like this Venn diagram in the middle will love it. Now, those people will love it.
Yes.
And there is a market there, and it may be a very profitable market. But you got all of a sudden, you've actually like like when you pitch it to your agent, the agent isn't like seeing it the way you're seeing it because you've got the wrong lens on,
Yeah, you've already created a huge hurdle for yourself because if I take it to a romance, in fact, I actually did this, and I'm sure that the client wouldn't even mind me talking about it necessarily. I did this early on in my career because at one point, I definitely thought romance authors were a little more flexible than they actually are prior to, like, I had a lot of learning to do in the romance kind of sphere when I first began. And it was one of my like first big projects because I really like reading rom-coms, and I sort of thought to myself like, oh, there's lots of, there's lots of different rom-coms. So surely the other romance genres, there's wiggle room too. Incorrect. Wrong. Romance is so formulaic. And if you have a book that has romance elements, that's great. You can pitch it to general like contemporary editors and that's fine. But if you're writing a romance book and you want it to be sold by a romance publisher, it really needs to check like very specific boxes. So unless like once your book is romance with paranormal elements, like if it doesn't follow all of the very specific guidelines for paranormal romance, like you're pretty much done. And I had this experience with a romantic suspense book where I was really hopeful and excited about this great book that I signed that was 100% romantic suspense, except that the protagonist wasn't law enforcement. I don't like representing books that have law enforcement in them. It's just like a personal taste and values thing for me. And so I thought this is awesome because it's like a nice twist on, like the romantic suspense genre. And we could not sell that book. I still haven't sold it. I love it so much. And like I can sing its praises until the cows come home, but unless I have a marketing team that's willing to take the chance on it, like there's just no way. People who read genre books, like they come in with a set of expectations, and if you're not meeting those expectations, like they're going to put the book down and they're going to be mad about it. So it's really tricky.
And it doesn't mean that you can't, take that book to another place necessarily, but it's like it does sort of like there is like a limitation that is built into the book. Now that limitation could change because the markets change. But I think like a lot of writers just don't understand the market. And
that's it. And changing the market is very slow. Like it has to be very incremental. You can step like an inch over the line of what the genre expects of you. And I could probably find like a great editor and a great marketing team that are like, yes, that's an interesting new twist. But to make like a huge change in one book, like forget it. It's not going to happen. So that change is like not as radical as people think it is.
Yeah, and I think this is one way that agents can really help a lot of writers is that I think you got to give it a weird catch-22 because on one hand,
it's hard.
The writers who really most need an agent are the ones who don't understand the markets. And also because they don't understand the markets, they will have a hard time finding the right agent.
It's true.
So it's a difficult thing. Like, what do you suggest that? So I think like something like Spanish risk relation, I think is really enlightening. And I wish more agents would do this kind of thing because it does sort of explain in a really detailed way the kinds of things you're interested in. And it shows that you're interested in a lot of different things. so like on one hand it's very narrow, like it's very much this that and the other, but in other ways it's very expansive, like romance to horror,
Yeah.
essay collections to cookbooks, it's a fascinating wish list in that respect, like the diversity of it, but also like the way in which you've got these very specific things you're looking for as your preferences. I mean, I think that, so one, like something writers can do is like do more research on agents, and like
Definitely.
really specifically like individual agents, like and understand, I think writers need to kind of just understand a bit more fully like this idea that, yeah, these agents have their ideas of what they want, which is partly personal, partly informed by market conditions and what they know is and isn't attractive to the editors that they know. But then also, like, there's just things that they want. Like you've got this great list about like things I wish somebody would have. It's like, well, what about a an adult retelling of the story of Saint Werburgh?
Do you know this story? It's
No,
such
I
a
was going to
weird
ask you about
story.
that.
It's about a saint who had magical geese, ultimately. Like, that's the very short version of that
Sure.
story.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's just such a great, I think it's because it's like a little known story. It's not one that I've ever seen a retelling of before, but I think that that one in particular, like I feel like you could retell it so many ways that would be so fascinating. But we're seeing mostly retellings these days in young adult, and I don't think it would really fly in young adult because it's not like a super like recognizable. I feel like the ones that do really well in young adult are often the ones that are like fairy tales or Shakespeare plays, like things that teenagers kind of already have a reference, like a frame of reference for. And so they can kind of be fascinated by the differences, or you can integrate it into a high school curriculum or something like that. But I'd love to see this story on shelves for adults. I think you could do weird things with it.
And another thing you were looking for, which is like your dream list here, is you've got it listed as weirdly specific asks, which I love. Anything in any age or genre or age range about life as a feminine K-pop trainee or performer, written based on lived experience. So somebody who actually was a K-pop trainee or performer should get in touch with you and write a novel about it.
100%. I've only ever found one book that's about this culture that's in English. I mean, maybe in the Korean market they have dozens. I don't know. I don't speak Korean, so but when I read it, I was fascinated. It is a very unique way to live your adolescent years. And there's one young adult book that I found that was written by a Korean Canadian author, and I loved it. I just ate it up. But all the others that I found have been written by people who are writing kind of from the outside, and I find that like in those kinds of cultures, there's so much that's like kind of in clubby. I love subculture books, like in general. I grew up like riding horses, for example. There's so much weird stuff that happens in the horseback riding world that you would never know unless you'd lived it. Or like figure skating is kind of like that too. Like there are all these, like what other things, like one time I heard someone say that they would really love a murder mystery set in like the tattoo artist subculture, and I was like, oh yeah, you could do so many like weird things with that. You can't see them right now, but I have all kinds of tattoos, and so yeah, it would just be like, I love those like very specific settings that people can only really know if they've been there, and you get to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit. And K-pop is such a weird, it's amazing. There's so many similarities with kind of like the 90s like boy band culture that we had in North America, but there are a lot of things that are very different too. And I think it's just like really rich for storytelling, but I don't know that we've really gotten there yet.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, like, so somebody looking at this, I think, would maybe just kind of maybe wonder why it's even listed here. Like, what are the odds? Yeah. A K-pop, former K-pop,
you really never
star
know, though.
Person, you never know. But I think like a writer like looking at that, I think the way to look at stuff like that is like it gives a sense clearly, like you just started to explicate it a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you're interested in this one really specific thing, but also it's just an example of the kind of thing you're interested in.
100%.
One, if somebody has some actual lived experience in some weird subculture, particularly trying to professionalize in the subculture that's hard to professionalize in, where there's all these in groups, there's all these unwritten rules, there's a weird, you can imagine all these interesting power politics that would be in play. and then this public versus private disparity seems like
Exactly.
just thematically something you're interested in.
And there's so much tension in those kinds of like high pressure environments too, right? It's a
Mhm.
really rich area for writing. And I feel like, yeah, anything like that that really teases out that kind of tension that can be really positive, but also really toxic and competitive. Yeah, I think there's definitely a market for that.
But even if somebody had a novel about, set in, the 20s, and it's a woman trying to make it in the military or something, like
Definitely.
there's like even though you're not asking for that, like that kind of thing is in that wheelhouse potentially. So I
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think like the way that artists, often I'll see writers are like looking at these lists and their eyes glaze over, like it's
Yeah.
like, well, I don't, either they'll do one of two things. They'll start writing a book about young cryptids and just
Yes.
thinking this is their way to get an agent.
Right.
But really, like, unless your heart's in that, you don't even want that agent in many
No,
ways.
exactly. And it's going to be like a long road for you if you just start writing
Hmm.
based on somebody's, you know, like weirdly specific ask, I guess. Like
Yeah.
that I have gotten a couple of queries from people that, have read my like weird specific list and been like, "Oh, I'm already working on this," or like I wrote this a few years ago and I queried it and I didn't get any responses, like that kind of thing. And I love that. But if you start if you look at the list and you're like, okay, I'm going to do that right now, like you have to make sure
Yeah.
that I still want it, like, 18 months from now when you've finished the very first draft. It's a lot of work.
And then the other thing I think is just interesting to kind of jump around. You have some specific. You say you a couple times. You point out, I'm really interested in identity-driven, accessible books with high
Yeah.
concept plots and confessional line-level writing, in which a setting plays a prominent role. So I wonder if you could talk about a couple of those things. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
obvious, I think, what an identity-driven book is, or even what an accessible book is, but I don't think a
Hmm.
lot of people are confused about high concept plots. Can you just explain a
Yeah,
little bit about that and what you mean by the setting playing a prominent role? Because I think that's a thing
absolutely.
that I think a lot of people, especially Canadians, have
Yeah.
the misperception that publishers want books that have no discernible setting.
Right. And I mean, so high concept to start with is one of those words that I get asked a lot, sort of like upmarket. It's one of those ones
Mhm.
that like has an industry meaning, but it doesn't really, if you like read just the literal words, it doesn't mean very much on a surface level. For me, high concept books are books that have a strong hook, I guess. So if the basic premise, I use it a lot with rom-com and horror, and that's partly because I get a lot of rom-com and horror that don't really have something unique about them, and that's why I have to walk away from them. Like they might have great characters, they might have like great writing, but if there's not something that's like timely and thought-provoking about the book, it's going to be really difficult to sell um, to a publisher. So like I'm trying to think of like a real world example and I'm coming up totally blank. But like the flat share, for example, I think I list on my manuscript wish list as a favorite of mine, or at least I've used that in the past. It's a rom-com, obviously, and it's a rom-com based on like a pretty normal trope, which is like the oh shoot, there's only one bed, like romance storyline. It's like that taken to the extreme. The hook, of course, is this idea of somebody like sharing an apartment with a stranger. It's a weird concept. It's like something that like most people would not consider doing, but the characters in this book are sort of like in these awkward circumstances that make it the right fit for them. And that makes it kind of fascinating. And sort of the K-pop book is actually a good example of that too, in a way. Like I love books about subculture and I love books about like power and how do we get power and how do we navigate places um, that are like high tension places like in the world. I think those things are really interesting. But K-pop in particular is like something that I think not many people in North America know an awful lot about in the way that people who have lived in that culture um, know. And so like that's something for me that would be really hooky. It's like a really unique kind of approach to storytelling. So whether it was like a horror book or a rom-com or a contemporary story, whatever, like the idea of setting it in kind of like this K-pop world is something that I haven't seen very much of. Just like the flat share, I think was very popular because it took this like very familiar trope that like romance readers already loved, but it put this really strange kind of twist on it where, these people were forced to share an apartment together. And never see each other. Like that's a weird thing that most of us don't go through. And I really like that. Actually, Satellite Love, which is a book that came out this year, is another one that's like, I just feel so strange about in such a great way. Like it's just your basic love story, except that one of the protagonists is a literal space satellite. Like that is an odd
Sure.
concept, you know? It's not something that comes up all the time. So when I say high concept, usually I'm looking for that hook. I'm looking for whatever it is that, like, when I read the pitch of the book, I'm going to go like, okay, I'm like understanding this, but like, there's going to be something in there that I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely want to know how that turns out.
Here's the example I always use to
Mhm.
explain the concept. So this is a log line for a story I just haven't got
Yeah.
around to writing yet. But it's the second oldest man in the world tries to kill the oldest man in the world to get into the
Yes.
Guinness Book of World Records.
Mhm.
So it very quickly is like
Yes,
as you say, it's hooky very quickly, but it also like gives you the conflict,
totally.
and it's very
Exactly.
clear like the kinds of things that would happen,
Yeah,
and even
for sure.
the tone of it is clear. It'd be a comedy, right? A kind of
Yeah.
dark comedy. So like there's a lot like kind of packed into a really condensed
That
sentence like
makes me
that.
think of what's that series that's very popular right now? Is it it's a day of the week, Tuesday or Thursday, Murder Club, that is,
Yeah,
you know,
the
like it's
Stephen
all about
Martin,
like,
David,
yeah, like
yeah, I haven't seen it yet,
true
but I
crime and
just
murder and
they've been
whatever, but
advertising it to
it's
me.
seniors, you know,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
like that's something that I think in cozy
Hmm.
mysteries we've seen it, but not so much in like the drama thriller, you know. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. It's got like a weird twist to it that you like maybe haven't. It's I think when people say that like books have like a je ne sais quoi, like that's what they're looking for, is that thing that like piques their interest, you know?
Yeah, my friend Phil and I came up with that log line. And what I like
Yeah.
about it as an example, I think for me, high concept, I think the easy way to explain to people is like when you hear that sentence, you know if you want to read it or not read it.
Yes. 100%.
So very quickly, like the concept is clear enough that it, or high enough as you want to, that it filters in or out like the
Exactly.
audience. And
Absolutely.
now you've got a couple
Oh,
other
and
quick
then there was
things.
something else in there that you wanted me to dig into, which was the
Oh,
setting,
which,
right?
yeah, the setting things. You started talking a little bit about that. Could you talk to me a bit more
Yeah.
about why the setting is so important to you? Because I think
Yeah.
a lot of people have the idea still that every book should be set in New York, even if
For
they've never
sure.
been to New York. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely. I mean, for me, setting is, I always tell people that like this is a bit of a cliche way to talk about it, but I always tell people that like setting is basically one of your characters. And what I mean when I say that is that like it needs to be, for me at least, like as fully developed as your characters are. So it has, you know, like a firm sense of place. It plays a role in your story. It has, you know, physical and emotional characteristics, all of those things. Um, it's true that historically, like books have sold more easily when they've been set in the United States, but I think they're, at least in the United States, if not New York. But I think that what that really translates to is being able to, for a reader, especially because okay, a lot of like let's be real about the reading market in North America for a second, is like, you know, a huge percentage is midwestern white women. Like, so if you picture like your midwestern white woman who's like, you know, a mom probably in her like 20s 30s going to Costco and seeing a book on a table in Costco where she's like, you know, got 84 other things on her mind, she's like wondering if they have the right bagels, and like her kid is like maybe like getting out of soccer practice soon, she's gonna like go to that table. I mean, we all probably have relatives like this too, like gonna go to that table, she's gonna scan the covers for like something that looks the most relatable, read a couple lines on the back, grab it, bring it home, cool. But the way that you actually get them to finish the book is by having something in it that they can relate to, because if your entire brain is taken up with trying to figure out what's going on in the book, you're never going to get through it, like when you're living this life, right? And so there's definitely things to be said for books that aren't that, but for books that you want to be like highly marketable, I think that the thing that I always consider is whether or not like that woman could relate to the setting in the book. So, you know, New York is the easy go-to because it's like the thing that's been used in media, like not just books, but like TV, like all kinds of things for like a huge amount of time. And so people can sort of picture themselves there. They know what like the taxis look like, whatever. Um, I'm not particularly interested in books that are like just based on like a New York life. So for me, I really want people to be able to understand the setting as they're reading in the same way that they would understand what New York is like. So a book that one of my authors wrote that's coming out next year in February. I was like, what month are we in right now? In February, is set in Boston in the Berkshires. And I've never been to the Berkshires. We had to have a lot of phone conversations about what the Berkshires were like when we were going through the editing of this book. But I think that at the version of the book that's going to be published is really like that setting comes to life in that book. Like you can feel what it's like to be there. And I think it is a unique setting that like not a lot of people have access to and not a lot of people have been to. But if it's really well crafted, you can still get that same relatability and that same sense of place that you would get from a book, that used all those invisible, easy kind of shortcut clues to tell you that it was set in New York or that it was set in the Hamptons or somewhere that's like a little more known. So I do think that, there is definitely an appetite for books set in New York. Don't get me wrong. Like it's definitely an easy sell to an editor to be able to say like that city that you live in, it's set there. The majority of editors live in New York for the big 5 publishers. But I think that if you're going to go outside of that, it has to be something that's really, really rich and lush. And that way people will love it just as much as, like if it was something that they were familiar with before picking up the book.
I think there's just also, you mentioned before, like you really like how when the setting is almost like a character. And I think there is a really strong draw to books where, in addition to the plot and the characters and so on, they're like learning something or immersed in the location, in a way that is almost like a vacation, strangely. Even if you don't want to be there, it's like you're on an island with a monster. We're trapped in this factory. Like even if you don't want to be there in that location in real life, there's an appeal to the insularity of getting to know like an environment. The way that like an office comedy, like The Office is part of the attractiveness of it.
For sure.
Or you mentioned the K-pop thing. Like I can imagine like that just being fascinating.
Totally.
Not even caring that much about K-pop, but like I can see like the power plays that would. One thing that's fascinating about J-pop is that a lot of those bands will own theaters and they'll play every night.
Which is amazing, right?
Which
it's
is
so
amazing.
Bizarre.
Maybe they're not doing it these days, but like broadly speaking, like it's just such a foreign way of doing things compared to like how we think about a band touring around, but they don't have time to tour around.
No.
Like they gotta play every night, 3 times a night, or whatever. And so it's just the unfamiliarity of that world, if it's drawn well and if it's compelling in and of itself, I think is like, you can see very easily, I think, how that would be attractive. Whereas like, not to pick on New York or anything, but like there's certain locations that have become generic, and they can be very well done still, but they often just are kind of like the readers kind of is fine with them and it passes by. Like as you say, they don't want to be in a world. And they don't want to be in a world where that doesn't make sense to them.
Right.
But they would rather have a new world make sense.
Exactly.
Now,
and when you mentioned like an island with a monster on it, like that book is going to be way scarier if not only you're battling with the monster, but also like you have this hostile island, right? Mm-hmm. If you really build that out as like an element of your story, to me, there shouldn't be anything taking up word count that's not intentional. So if that's part of your story that you want to write in, that you're like on this weird ass island somewhere, like write it in, like make me feel like I'm there. And then if not, then set it in New York. It's fine.
I think there are tropes that writers go to because they're comfortable with it. And I always tell people, like when I teach creative writing, I'm like, you got to like identify those things and then question them, because it's not, people will often make up these rules of writers. Like they say like, oh, well, you can't have a character wake up in the morning at the start of a story. So that's usually a bad idea, but you could do it. What if you put them on a houseboat? What if they wake up and then they're drinking coffee on this houseboat? They kind of like, they wake up, they're in a swamp, drunk on a houseboat. They dump their leftover still alcohol over the side. They scoop up some swamp water. They drain it through a sock,
Yep, exactly.
And then they start making coffee with it. As they're drinking coffee, the cup shadows because somebody is shooting at them.
That's
like
it. That's
you
not your average morning, right?
right, but like it is still the morning waking up.
Yeah.
It's just that I've just taken and deconstructed the elements of it and just
Yeah.
made every single one of them unfamiliar.
Totally.
So it's machinic. I can do that on a very simple craft way without even necessarily thinking too much about it. But like writers will not often do that kind of analysis of what they've done.
Absolutely.
Like they're just kind of like go with this trope or that trope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that they can't get away with it if they kind of just, in that case, I'm just using the setting really, and then just introducing a conflict element. But like, you know, it's the unfamiliarity of it now. Like we saw with True Detective, that kind of Louisiana setting played so much into the that's, you know, that show, to the point where some people were overlooking flaws of the show in other respects. But like, you know, it just is one of those things where I think it's really it's such an important like aspect of the story potentially.
Yeah,
that it's so often a shame when writers aren't using it in some way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like honestly, like you'll see the marketability and success of that too, in even just like huge TV properties and things like that. Like, why did they make CSI in like 8 different cities? You know, part of it is because, you know, the atmosphere of those cities like changes the kinds of stories you get to tell, and it gives you more options. It gives you more, you know, like even just in terms of like the atmospheric elements, it gives you a lot more to play with if you're not constantly in the same place all the time. And so I feel like, you know, like consumers, readers, viewers, whatever, are hungry for that, but it has to be done in a way that, you know, really immerses them, and not that just gets kind of shoehorned in as like a side note.
Yeah, I think that shoehorning, as you point out, is the death of so many things. Before I let you go, I got to ask you to talk about how you went to college for circus arts and spent nearly a decade performing and coaching at a professional level.
I did do that. When I was growing up, this is like one of my cringy stories. When I was growing up, my first boyfriend ever dumped me when I was like in middle school, and I was grieving as one does when you're like 14 years old. And so I learned how to juggle, and really got involved in circus in Newfoundland, which is where I grew up, which is like a very small community there, as you can imagine. And decided for a brief period of time that like that was what I wanted to spend my life doing. And actually, to be honest, like that does it. I feel like it was sort of a step on the way to like figuring out where I am now, because I loved being in a creative environment all the time. That was really, really fun. But I didn't love performing. I didn't love like the criticism that came with that, and just like the pace of that life really didn't do well for me. And I'm also like, I'm a chronic overthinker. I'm like very like to a detriment intellectual, I think, in some ways. And so I really struggled being in an environment that was like very athletic all the time, and that didn't really take itself very seriously. I spent a lot of time kind of questioning things that people didn't want questioned. And so that's how I ended up doing a lot of coaching. And I really loved that. That was how I paid my way through my university studies largely until I moved to Toronto. And it was so much fun. It was like really great getting to like help people craft their acts and their, you know, performance. And I worked a lot on artistic, I was like an artistic specialist for a while. So I consulted with bigger circus companies who were trying to put together more conceptual shows and things like that. But yeah, I also just taught kids how to jump on a trampoline safely and things like that for a long time. Yeah, it was super, super fun. And when I decided to leave, it was mostly because my body is just like couldn't handle it anymore. It's not a very friendly profession for grownups. And so I ended up getting a bunch of injuries and stuff. But I think that publishing is like the first sort of job I found where I'm like straddling both kind of artistic and intellectual worlds in a way that's really, really satisfying. So I do feel like my circus life is like a little bit relevant also because when I read books about the circus, I get like a little bit hypercritical of them, I think, when they are unrealistic to sort of the challenges that people face in that industry. So that's another subculture that I love when people delve into.
I was going to say, it sounds like it certainly would play a part in your sort of attraction to subcultures, or just the idea that there's the richness in this environment here.
For sure. And like the sort of grittiness too, you know, like I think I love stories I think a lot of people do, where something that's like really shiny and perfect on the outside, like you really kind of get into what's maybe creepy or twisty or tense on the like
The
behind the sheen.
David Lynch sort of
Yeah.
idea of like this, the surface and the depth being at the strange uh, opposite ends of a spectrum.
Yeah, I think the like popularity of domestic thrillers has really put that into high relief over the last few years, that, we all have a little bit of that voyeur in us, that, you want to see what's going on behind the facades of things.
Well, I appreciate you talking to me, and I just want to end off. I'd like to maybe ask you.
Mhm.
I mean, it's notes here in your manuscript wish list that you're open to queries. Um, you know that you only accept queries for complete or revised works under 1,000 K, and so on and so forth. You've got a Westwood submission page for details,
Yeah.
but like just in a broad sense, if somebody is a writer
Mhm.
and they're looking into agents, I guess my really quick, maybe it's not a quick question, but like my
Yeah.
final sort of like all encompassing question is, what makes, why should a writer have an agent, and what should they do to figure out what agent they should have?
Right. That's a big question for sure, but it's definitely a useful one. Um, I think that, so what I always tell people, and you and I were talking about this a little bit before, because um, I do sign authors that are like at various stages in their careers, right? And so I think for different clients, you always play like a bit of a different role depending on where they're at and what it is they have going on. Um, for me personally, I think that agents are most useful when people, they know they want to write, they know that they want it to be a part of their professional life. I think that that's something that people get tripped up on, because it really is like, publishing is like any professional industry. It demands a lot of people. It has a lot of like specific kind of um, struggling to come up with another word for demands, because that's really what I mean. Like, if you want to be successful in publishing, it's like being successful in any other professional industry. You need to have the time and the energy and the commitment. And I think maybe even more so than in some industries, frankly, because writing is really hard. It can be isolating for a lot of people. It can be really difficult to find ways to like make enough money as a writer if you want to be doing that full time. Or if you don't want to be doing that full time, like finding the balance of, what else you're going to do while you're pursuing that as more of a passion or what have you. But I think the role of an agent in that is that we're really good at sort of taking things off of people's plates so that they can focus on the creative aspects. And I think that it's very difficult for authors to well, for anybody really, to sort of compartmentalize the fact that publishing is so much about capitalism when it comes down to it. I feel like I always say to my authors, like, publishing is, there's lots of good things about books. Like, books have all kinds of like awesome layers to them, but publishing as an industry is capitalism all the way down. And it's really something I think it bears repeating, because I think that people forget, like how much of this industry, how many times I have to like step aside on a query that I love because I just know that like there's no possible way I could sell it to a big five editor. Like, it's really, really hard. So I think that having those kinds of capitalist considerations, like sales of the book, like contract negotiation, like, like chasing the publicity team to make sure they get back to you, following up on like, when you've got a publisher who's like not getting back to you about like your cover design or whatever, all of that stuff, like that's what I spend most of my days doing when I'm not, like editing or reading queries or whatever. um, and I really enjoy, like, I'm a very type A, like organized person. And so it gives me a lot of satisfaction to be able to take that kind of stuff off of people's plates and be like, listen, this stuff is really hard to navigate. So you focus on like writing the thing and making it really perfect, and I'll focus on all the rest of this, you know. Um, I think that some authors struggle with that. Like, I don't know that it is right for every author. I think a lot of authors who have a background in particularly self-publishing, like they like to have all of the control over every tiny little aspect. And sometimes that can be difficult to have if you have an agent as like sort of a middle person in that like relationship between you and your editor. So I think there's always like a balance to find. Um, but yeah, I think that that's sort of like the strength of having an agent, is not having to learn all the minutia of the industry, in the sense that um, you know how to do a proper submission, or like how to format the document, like all of that kind of stuff. I think that those are the reasons why agents have a lot of appeal to authors, because it means you can focus on, you know, your creative relationship with the editor who ultimately acquires your work. You can focus on, you know, what you're going to write next and what you're writing now, as opposed to wondering who you should submit it to, or, you know, what the trends are in publishing these days, or what have you. But in terms of looking like what to look for in an agent or who to look for, I think it does take a lot of work. And I think that a lot of people are very anxious to rush through the query process, which I totally understand, because it's long and it's stressful and it's super annoying. But definitely, like, I've had to step aside sometimes when people come back to me and say, like, you know, I have to make a decision in 1 week, because I'm like, there is no possible way I can get to know you enough in 1 week. Like, if you've just sent me like a cold query like 2 days ago, you know, like, it's just not a thing. Sometimes I will enter into those fights if it's an author who I've known and enjoyed their work before, because I know kind of the creative side, what I'm getting into a little bit more. But very rarely, I'm much more likely to sort of say, like, you know what, like, probably if that's your priority, if that timeline is your priority, I'm not the right person for you. And part of that is also setting up realistic expectations, because publishing as an industry overall is the slowest. So it's important to know going into things that, like, you know, things aren't necessarily going to happen in a couple of weeks. It's more likely a couple of months or a couple of years. So it really is a long game for me. I hope that was very rambling, but I hope it answered your question.
No, I think it makes perfect sense, and is a great answer. And so again, people can find more about Emmy at Westwood Creative Artists, the agency that Emmy works with. And where else are you online in a useful capacity?
I do have a book blog, which I refer people to sometimes. I started it when I was a bookseller, so I post less frequently now than I used to, but it's at booksbeyondbinaries.blog. And if people want to get a sense of the kinds of things I like, that's like a really great place to go, because I interview authors and review books and things like that there. I make reading lists and stuff. And so if people want to get a sense for like the kinds of things I'm reading or the kinds of things that I'm enjoying, that's a great place to look. I'm also on Twitter, Emmy_of_spines, like book spines, but also like creepy spines. And I try to post as much as possible about kind of like the things that are on my mind, or the things I'm consuming, or my timelines, things that will be useful to authors, and not just screaming into the void of Twitter.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
Thanks so much for talking to me, and have a great day. And
Thank you.
thanks for, you know, helping to enlighten people a bit about the very murky waters of publishing.
Thank
Which,
you.
you know, I think often are kind of intentionally murky. So I always appreciate when people like yourself are kind of stepping out to try to kind of clarify things for people, for writers who I think otherwise, you know, it's a hard industry to kind of get a handle on in many respects.
It is. Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that, but certainly one reason is just that there's a kind of a weird investment that the industry has in keeping the waters murky.
Oh my gosh, we can do a whole other podcast on that one day.
Well, maybe we will one day, yeah, for sure. But thanks so much for talking to me, and have a great day.
You too.